let's hit the budget cap. That obviously broke after the three of us were able to meet and get together a week ago. For newer fans listening, can we just start with what is the budget cap? What does it exactly entail? And what accusations are being leveled at Red Bull?
Okay, well, let's start with what it is. So it's actually an idea stolen from American sports. The idea that you make the sport fairer, there's a more level playing field if you have a budget cap in place. Now, my understanding of American sports, that's usually to do with players' salaries. Of course, in F1, it's a little bit different. You have the two drivers. Their salaries are exempt from the budget cap. There's talk about bringing them in, but we won't go down that rabbit hole because it upsets the drivers quite a lot. But instead, it's about car development. So it's about how much money you put into developing your car. That includes the engineers working back at the factory. It actually includes the cost of traveling around and racing as well. So it's basically everything to do with developing the car and put it on track is more or less what's in there. There's exemptions to do with marketing and things like that, so that the teams can still spread the good word of Formula One around the world. But yeah, really, that's what it comes down to, is like developing the car and put it on the track. And the idea being is that you had this situation where the top teams were spending upwards of $400 million in a season on a car. And then at the back of the grid, you had teams, struggling to get together a budget of about 80 million, to go racing. So there's this huge gap between the haves and the have-nots in F1. And of course, it led to the situation that we've become quite accustomed to, of one team dominating the sport. We saw it with Ferrari, we saw it with Red Bull, we saw it with Mercedes, and now it looks like Red Bull might do it again. So that's what the idea is that everyone has. Last year, it was up to $145 million to spend. This year, they've brought it back a little bit to $140 million. Next year, it goes to $135 million, and then it's going to stay around there. But the idea being that all the teams have the same amount of money to play with, and therefore it's that bit fairer. Now, because last year was the first year, we haven't been through this process of teams kind of having their accounts scrutinized on a regulatory level by the FIA. So the FIA have their own accountants who have taken a look at all these accounts, which were submitted in March for the previous season. And they spent essentially six months working through it, trying to understand, is what the team submitted. I mean, most of the teams, as far as I know, submitted under that 145, but how about other things they may have omitted? How about some money they might have put in this pot, which actually belonged in the development pot? And then has that pushed them over that 145 figure? And that's what we're waiting to hear on. And at the moment, we're at this kind of limbo stage where there's all these rumors about teams that may have broken it. The rumors on Red Bull and Aston Martin may have broken it, but we don't know for certain, because Red Bull are pretty adamant. They're very certain, in fact, that the accounts they submitted were underneath. They're saying about 4 million underneath. And then there's been all this back and forth with the FIA, this auditing process that maybe has brought them closer to it. And the big question is whether it's brought them over it. And that's what we're meant to find out. We were meant to find out on Wednesday, nicely in time for everyone arriving in Suzuka. But the FIA decided they needed more time. They'd already delayed it twice before that. So this is the third delay. And then we should find out on Monday after the Japanese Grand Prix. And of course, it's a huge story if it comes out, because if teams have overspent, and we're talking really, probably we're talking small amounts that they've gone over. But Lewis Hamilton today, for example, was saying, even an extra million, if we'd been able to have that, I would have been able to bring another update, or Mercedes would have been able to bring another update to my car last year that could have made the difference in the championship. And he's right. A million will go a long way to manufacturing a new floor, even if it's not redesigning parts, it's just replacing tired old parts. There's minimal bits of performance in that. And we saw how close last year's championship was. So this is why it's such a big deal. And then there's a question of what happens next, and is there a punishment? But because I've spoken for quite a lot, I'm going to hand that thorny issue over to Nate.
That's a hospital pass, as we call that in rugby. I think the punishment side of it is fascinating as well, because we saw during Singapore, people were almost assuming, the absolute worst in terms of the breaches, and they were saying people have to be kicked out of championships, etc. But the FIA's regulations on this are actually quite clear. They define a minor and a major breach, which is 5% overspend, which I think equates to about $7 million. And a minor breach, you can still get points taken away, but it's more likely you err on the side of a financial penalty for a team in that position. I think you might argue that's within the margin of error. Like Laurence said, some of this back and forth might be a team submitted this report in, it comes back and they say, well, actually this we think this is over, Whereas a major breach, that's when you start talking about suspension from world championships, exclusion from world championships, etc. And that's then what, you know, where you think to yourself, well, would they take away Max's championship, or would they take away, you know, would they disqualify Red Bull from the Constructors' Championship? Which, if you think back to the last major scandal in Formula One, was Spygate back in 2007. Lewis Hamilton, when he won the championship in 2008, McLaren were disqualified from that year's Constructors' Championship, and that was a direct result of that. So it was a big punishment for the team with a huge fine on top of that. But it didn't affect, the driver performance in that instance. So, while people might say that would be an unfair way to do it, the Constructors' Championship for the teams is still the prestigious one. That's where the prize money's based. That's where, and Red Bull, if you're looking this year, I mean, Red Bull haven't won that since the start of the decade. So really thorny issue. And I think the FIA, but F1, in a larger picture, are in a bit of a tricky situation, because I think anybody who reads budget cap breach, Red Bull, Max Verstappen, if that is what comes out on Monday, are immediately going to think, well, last year's championship was tainted. And I think a lot of people already kind of think that. And, it's difficult because the integrity of the championship is key. You need to have faith in the governing body. And I think that while, a budget cap breach would be nothing to do with the FIA, I think it would be interpreted as, if, unless it was the harshest penalty for a lot of people, they would say, I don't believe in the integrity of this championship, which I don't think is fair, because, a financial audit is what it is. It's quite a boring, quite a lengthy process. And, I think that everything that came out of the weekend, I think, has already convinced a lot of people that Red Bull have made some egregious, massive overspend, and that they deserve to be kicked out of the championship. It's kind of like a guilty until proven innocent type of thing. I have no idea what's going to be in that audit. I'm just assuming, what people have been saying is based on something. No smoke without fire. But it's a tricky one. So punishments, I mean, I'm glad I'm not working for the FIA in this instance, because I can't really see a situation where they win, because there's always going to be someone who's upset with the punishment handed out. I mean, it's the same for Aston Martin as well, right? If the rumors are true, there's two teams that have overspent in some way. So yeah, just a really tricky one. But to be honest, this is why a budget cap's important. I think this first year, there was probably always going to be a long audit, and it's probably going to be likely that teams were spending right on the limit of that. But yeah, a difficult one to really have an opinion on, isn't it? Until we actually know what the deal is. But Laurence is absolutely right about the fine margins. I mean, even look at last weekend, the top three in qualifying was split by 0.5 of a second. And if Lewis had that extra 0.5, whether it be in car performance or whether, it's from his own performance, he's on pole position, and the result of that race at a circuit like that might have been different. And you look at that across the course of a season, small amounts of money could have a big impact. So I think that there's going to be two arguments going on if there's been a breach. One is around the rules, and one is around what the FIA's kind of regulations allow them to penalize people with. And the other one then is going to be kind of, I don't say an ethical one, but a sporting one, of people saying, well, is this fair for a team to get away with a breach if there has been a breach with say quote unquote just a fine? But on the outside looking in, a lot of people are saying, well, these are big F1 teams that can probably get away with paying fines. So you open up a huge hornet's nest here. I'm hoping that just all 10 teams on Monday get their 10 certificates saying they're under. But I think a lot of people, even in that situation, because of all the rhetoric we've had, will say, well, there's been some kind of cover up. So it feels like we're just in this kind of lose-lose situation.
Lose-lose.
Either way, which is kind of a shame, because, you want to have faith in the governing body. I saw Laurence said he'd talked for a while. I've been rambling now for a little bit, but I saw a lot of people saying, the FIA, the way they handled Abu Dhabi last year, it's no surprise they'd try and cover this up. And I think it's really important for people that kind of go down that rabbit hole of, there's such a big difference between the FIA making a mistake in a 5-minute window in Abu Dhabi last year and kind of being clumsy about how they handled it afterwards, having the mistake already been made in the rearview mirror, versus suggesting that they're part of some kind of 6-month conspiracy to, hide some overspend. So I think people have to kind of take a step back from all the emotion of last year and actually wait until all that stuff comes out Monday. Trust the audit process has been fair, which from the time and the fact there's been delays, you would suggest that is the case. And then we can start throwing stones at each other once once that comes out. But I think people are kind of already jumping the gun on exactly what is going to come out.
Never have the two of you anticipated reading a budgetary document so much in your entire lives.
I mean, I don't even pay this much attention to my finances, let alone
right?
to other teams.
I do think something that. Go ahead, Laurence.
So somebody at the FIA, I was asking questions about the process and everything, and they said, well, the document's not even that big, and I think it's about 20 pages. But in the world of the FIA, that is a not very big document. Like the technical regulations are much longer. So yeah, you get fairly adept at picking out like the right clauses and stuff in documents like that. But yeah, this one is an interesting one, because the other danger is that, you know, if you find ways to get around it, if there are ways to kind of just put spending in a slightly different pool that isn't covered by the budget cap, you then end up in this becoming a championship for accountants rather than a championship for engineers and drivers. And that's something that F1 has to be careful with as well. Not only is this about the integrity of the sport, it's also about how this sport develops in the future. You know, if it becomes about how clever you are with your finances, that's not particularly exciting to explain, look, this is how you know, Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton won a world championship. It's much more exciting if we talk about the on-track battles or the incredibly novel engineering solutions that the teams come up with. So it's a really important moment for the sport, because the budget cap is there for all the right reasons. It is there to make the sport more exciting, bring it closer together. I know it doesn't look like that's the case after the start of this year, because, you know, top three teams are still a long way ahead, but over time it should do that. So it's an important moment, and that's why it's so important that the FIA get this right, which is why I completely understand them saying, if, you know, they weren't ready to give out these certificates of compliance to the teams that had hit the budget cap, then fair enough if they need a little bit more time, because ultimately we're already however many 10 11 months on from the championship finale in Abu Dhabi last year. So a little bit longer, you know, to find out what happened exactly last year with the finances isn't too bad.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.